he won 7 world championships and changed Formula One from a gentleman's sport into a $3 billion business. Before Chapman, Britain was the outsider. After Chapman, only Britain counted.
As an individual, Chapman was a complete firebrand, a complete original. He created an era. His way of thinking dominated racing for years to come. To my mind, it was tragic that he was never given a knighthood. If anybody deserved to be Sir Colin Chapman, it was he.
From 1961 to 1978, if you beat Lotus and Chapman, you'd won.
And he would do anything for his team Lotus, anything. And I don't think he really cared whether it was defrauding shareholders or defrauding anybody else. I suspect that he probably wouldn't even have thought about it.
He was a genius and he was a rogue. Definitely a genius, allegedly a rogue.
The last year of Chapman's life was overshadowed by rumours surrounding his involvement in the DeLorean conspiracy, perhaps the financial scandal of the 1980s. But as the investigators closed in, his early death saw him take his secrets to the grave. When Chapman started building cars, just after the war, the British motor industry was the second biggest in the world, after the USA. But its products were too often old-fashioned, heavy and clumsy. In contrast, Chapman's cars would be modern, light and agile. In motor racing, Britain was not just an outsider, but had nothing to compete with the Germans and Italians, who had dominated Grand Prix since the 20s. Grand Prix was a matter of national pride. The Italian cars were red, the German silver, the French blue, the British racing green. But there were no winning British cars. No British car had ever won a single Grand Prix. No British driver had ever been world champion. Britain was the sporting loser.
Rolls number 36, leading British car, is in 16th place as they go through the other half of the loop at Country Corner.
Chapman changed all that, and, almost as an afterthought, created the only new post-war British car company, designing some of the most radical road cars ever made. Chapman had started building cars as a 19-year-old engineering student in a lock-up garage in London in 1947. The first 2 Lotuses were trials cars, based on old Austins, and he took Hazel, his future wife, as his passenger. 4 years later, he built his first racing car, winning everything as both driver and designer. His secret weapon was getting more power from the engine everyone used by exploiting a loophole in the regulations, a typical Chapman move.
To Colin, rules were something to be challenged, to be circumvented, and he must have spent hours reading rule books and trying to find loopholes. If he was involved in framing rules, he would make sure that the rules were framed with a loophole available to him.
By 1955, Chapman was becoming so successful, he gave up his full-time job, and Lotus made its first appearance at Le Mans, with him as #1 driver. The next year, he entered 3 Lotuses, and one of them won its class, helping to sell over 200 similar models in 1 year. Chapman was well on his way. A few weeks later, by chance, a cameraman was filming during practice for the French Grand Prix. What he was about to capture would prove to be a key moment in Chapman's career. His brakes failed, costing him the chance of a Formula One debut. He never would race in a Grand Prix.
When he drove a van wall, he was very nearly as quick as Hawthorne. I've driven with Stewart, Graham Hill, Sterling, Fangio even. And Colin was as good, smooth. I never had a problem riding with him as a passenger. Other people have, but I didn't.
From now on, Chapman concentrated on design, not driving. And at the next motor show, Lotus showed 3 cars. The Lotus 7, still made today, the Lotus Elite, arguably the best-looking car of its time, and the Lotus 12, which pointed the way towards Chapman's Formula One ambitions. The big moment arrived 3 years later, when a Lotus won a Grand Prix for the first time at Monaco, in the hands of Britain's most famous driver.
Well, in his early days of his racing cars, of course, frankly, they were beautiful to drive. Not easy, but delicate, but very, very quick, very light, and I can tell you very delicate as far as the strength was concerned. And in fact, I had quite a few wheels come off. The most important one, in a way, I suppose, was when I was racing at Spa, and my front wheel came off at about 140 miles an hour, and obviously I knew there was something wrong because I could see it go, and I managed to spin out and go in the bank backwards. I broke my back and my legs on that occasion.
His structures professor, when he was studying engineering, had told him that, you know, any damn fool can build a bridge, and it won't fall down, but it takes a man of much greater skill to build a bridge that just won't fall down. In other words, that working at the margin was very, very typical of Colin's operations in general, and very particular in the sense that he worked on very few principles about engineering. These were elegance, refinement, simplicity. He was a stylist, I guess, in some ways, rather than a real engineer.
I remember at the American Grand Prix, which I won in, I think, 59 or something, and they made me a cake with a Lotus on top, and the first cut I made, of course, was one of the wheels, and I said, would you give it to Colin Chapman? And he didn't think it was funny at all.
Colin was uninterested in both spectators and certainly deeply uninterested in safety. Never heard him utter a word about whether his monocoques were, what would happen if your driver's legs got chopped off in it. Never a word.
When you're dealing with people's lives, and you are when wheels fall off at over 100 miles an hour, or even less, I think it's something one has to think about, and I don't think it worried him too much at the beginning.
Once he even tried to convince officials that paper was fireproof.
And he'd taken a road map from the wall of the garage where he was working and had put it between the engine and the driving compartment, cut holes for the steering column and cables and wires, and had painted it with aluminium paint. And the officials were absolutely scandalised and said, this is not a fireproof bulkhead. And Colin said, yes, it is, and there was quite a row going on, which they didn't seem to be able to resolve. And I was asked if I would be prepared to protest that he was going to be allowed to compete, not complying with the rules. And I said, no, you do your own dirty work.
Chapman's reputation for putting lightness before safety haunted him a decade later. He was charged with manslaughter following the death of Joachim Rindt.
When the car swung, it hit a post for an overhead loudspeaker and swung round, and it tore the front of the car off, front wheel's bulkhead, and of course his feet were in the pedals. It pulled him through the seat belts and they cut his throat, and he died in the wreckage on the spot. The Italians impounded the wreckage and Colin was charged with manslaughter, and the charge was dismissed, and Colin was very cross. He said, I didn't want to get off because I had retained the best lawyer. I wanted it proved that I don't make unsafe racing cars.
Chapman was finally cleared of Rindt's death, but the accusations against his cars of being fragile and unsafe never went away.